So many artists in the post-war period focused on the explosion of visual culture. Mass media and consumer products saturated societies and reflected the popular tastes of the masses rather than those of the elite. Both the advertising industry and celebrity culture grew. Brightly colored advertisements became increasingly well-designed and persuasive in shaping consumer tastes and choices, and artists were quick to borrow recognizable commercial imagery and adapt mass media visual effects to make commentary on consumer society and popular culture. Pop art emerged first in Britain in the 1950s. A 1956 London exhibition titled This Is Tomorrow incorporated items such as Hollywood movie posters and product ads to blur the distinction between low visual culture designed for the masses and high art or culture, meaning the paintings and sculptures of museums. The movement took off worldwide in the 1960s, but its primary development was in the US, particularly in New York City, which was at the center of the international art market at the time. British artist Richard Hamilton was an early supporter of pop. He argued that mass visual culture was quickly replacing traditional art for the general public. Movies, TV, and ads now defined the standards of beauty and status, not high art, and society's idols were now movie stars and celebrities rather than politicians or military heroes. Hamilton sought to express this new world of excessive consumption by creating collages of images taken from advertising, as he's done in this collage, which is titled, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing? Here, Hamilton parodies advertising slogans in his title, and then the collage itself satirizes modern life, mocking marketing strategies, consumer culture, and excess, and projecting a sort of utopian vision for post-war society. Pretty people with enough money and leisure time to enjoy cheap, plentiful material goods and entertainment. Hamilton's collage depicts two figures, a muscle man who Hamilton has named Adam, and a pinup girl whom he calls Eve, um, in a domestic setting, a consumerist paradise, really. So here, the sin of Adam and Eve is kind of excessive consumption of goods. Or maybe we could read this as Adam and Eve trying to recreate the lost paradise of the Garden of Eden by filling their home with all of the best new products. We can see a tape recorder, a TV, trendy new furniture, a lamp with a Ford emblem. There's a canned ham on the table, and there's a vacuum cleaner on the stairs here. And he's even included the little blurb about, how much further this particular product will reach up the stairs than most vacuum cleaners on the market at the time. On the wall, we have this poster advertising a romance novel, and then out the window, we can see a nearby theater advertising a jazz singer. Adam holds this huge Tootsie Pop rather suggestively, which is one possible source for the movement's name. Hamilton here is making a comment on the omnipresence of consumerism and the visual overload of pop culture. He's thinking about how consumer society appeals to our base drives and senses and desires, and how much of society seems to be unable to differentiate between reality and advertisement. American pop of the 1960s was, in general, bolder and more aggressive than British pop. These artists incorporated images from popular mass culture into their art, blurring boundaries between art and life, but they were much more influenced by commercial and industrial styles and techniques, especially mass production. American pop art typically has a flat commercial feel that erases the presence of the individual artist's hand. This cool mechanical detachment reflects the glorification of popular culture, and it critiques the tendency of consumer culture to transform everything into a commodity to be sold. But many also interpret this as a direct rebuke of abstract expressionism's more personal, emotional, and psychological expressions. Roy Lichtenstein investigated how popular imagery connects with high art, basing his paintings on mass-produced visual culture, particularly from comic books. In the early 1960s, he began making paintings based on romance and war comics, cropping and simplifying the source images, but otherwise imitating the comic format, including the speech bubbles and texts. Lichtenstein tends to use heavy black outlines and limited flat color palettes based on the colors used in commercial printing. He also replicated the effect of commercial printing techniques of the time by hand painting tight rows of individual dots of color called Ben-Day dots. Again, Lichtenstein favored war and romance comics, so the subjects of these paintings tend to be emotionally charged and even somewhat melodramatic. But he's then subverted that with the cool, formal, impersonal style and commercial techniques. This work from 1964, which is titled "Oh Jeff, I Love You Too," but it condenses an entire melodramatic, romantic storyline into a single frame, zooming in on the woman's emotive face, and then the text kind of leaves us hanging, wondering if the couple is about to break up or if they're going to work it out. Here's another example of Lichtenstein's work. This one is Wham from 1963. And so here we have that interest in the violence and the action. At the time that he made this, society's wounds were still very raw from World War I and II. And so it's perhaps a bit bold that he's chosen this subject. He presents a panel from a war comic showing an American fighter pilot firing a missile and hitting an enemy plane. Again, he uses kind of a limited color palette, mostly primary colors here, and he keeps the text and the dialogue balloons, presenting us with sort of a parody of the melodrama that is pop culture. This is one of the largest comic strip paintings that he made. It's nearly 14 feet wide, so quite monumental. Andy Warhol began his career in the 1950s as a commercial artist and illustrator, working with companies like Tiffany & Co., the New York Times, Columbia Records, Vogue, NBC, etc. And then he moved into the art world, incorporating images of popular consumer items from the world of advertising. He produced a huge body of work between 1960 and his death in 1987, including paintings, prints, sculptures, and films. He's most popular for his repetition of mass media imagery and his cheap industrial silkscreen printing method. Uh, Screen printing involves using a fine mesh screen, traditionally made of silk, hence the name silk screening, and you use that screen as a printing stencil. The negative space of the image is blocked off on the screen before ink or paint is forced through it, printing the two-dimensional design on a variety of surfaces. Warhol favored screen printing with acrylic paint to sort of mimic the bright, flat colors of advertisements. This technique was great for making numerous images cheaply, quickly, and efficiently, and thus Warhol sort of used it as a commentary on American culture. He was very interested in blurring the lines between not only art and life, but also between art, life, business, and industry. In 1965, he named his studio The Factory and employed a whole host of assistants who worked with assembly line efficiency to further highlight the commercial aspect of his art. So again, his subject matter is typically drawn from popular consumer items and images. He often used things like Coca-Cola bottles in the logo, especially in the early 60s. He wrote in his autobiography, "You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking." So I think really he's thinking about this sort of democratization that happens because of consumer culture. Regardless of your wealth or your status, you're getting the same thing. Warhol is probably most famous for his depictions of Campbell's soup cans. He talked about why he chose the soup cans as a subject, saying, "I used to drink it. I used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years, I guess, the same thing over and over again." Um, his first iteration of these was in 1962. And at the time, there were 32 flavors of Campbell's soup. So he created 32 canvases, one for each flavor. And he originally displayed them in a gallery like this, kind of lined up on the wall, mimicking how the cans might look on the shelf in a grocery store. His first sculptural project came in 1964 with his Brillo soap pad boxes, which are essentially replicas. He hired carpenters to create plywood boxes that were identical in size and shape to the cardboard cartons used to ship boxes of Brillo soap pads to supermarkets. He then exhibited these in an Upper East Side gallery in New York City in a show that he called the American Supermarket in 1964. He transformed the gallery space into what looked like a small supermarket, complete with goods, produce, and advertisements, all of which was created by him and about 5 or 6 other pop artists. He stacked his fabricated Brillo boxes in piles, kind of mimicking the piles of merchandise waiting to be unboxed, shelved, and sold. And then the cans on display, and then all of the fruit and meat here, all of that is again fabricated by one of the various pop artists who were involved. At this exhibition, Warhol sold some of his paintings for about $1,500. He also sold autographed cans of Campbell's soup for about $6, and then they also sold these silk screened shopping bags for about $2. All in all, the exhibition was directly confronting the public with pop art and deliberately pushing boundaries, pointing to the commercial foundation of the art gallery system, critiquing the nature of art itself, and drawing attention to or even glorifying the mundane. Warhol was also very interested in ideas of fame and celebrity, and he examined American heroes and movie stars, as he's done here in this 1962 work titled Marilyn Diptych. This is one of a series of silkscreens that he made pretty immediately after the actress's death. He's memorialized her iconic on screen image, but not necessarily her true self. He silkscreened a famous publicity picture of her 50 times across 2 silver canvas panels. The bright acrylic colors, bold black contours, and uniform shadows really flatten the image, highlighting her signature features like her blonde hair, her red lips, her blue eyeshadow, but emphasizing those to the point that the image is sort of a caricature or a mask. The repetition of the image evokes the star's frequent presence in mass media. Additionally, the flat, unmodulated colors on the left panel contrast quite strongly with the black and white images on the right, which notice these sort of fade progressively and smudge as they've been printed and reprinted without cleaning or re-inking the screen, until really all that remains is this sort of ghostly image of a disappearing person. This is deeply symbolic, relating to ideas of how Marilyn's celebrity status and the public's knowledge of her will inevitably fade after her death until she's faded into just a memory. Also, the diptych format of this work, it's got some religious connotations as well. So diptychs, or two-paneled works like this, were common formats for altarpieces for centuries. And so perhaps he's chosen this format to comment on how society worships celebrities like Marilyn Monroe, and or to sort of imply that she was a martyred saint or goddess. Around the same time that pop artists were gaining attention, another New York based group began exploring a reductive form of geometric abstraction. They produced sparse geometric objects in a highly planned and rational style that we now know as minimalism. Minimalism rejected the psychological, emotional expression and metaphorical content of more traditional works. Minimalist works tend to lack any objective content, therefore, we could consider them to be non objective works. And they embraced industrial processes and materials, often using mass produced, prefabricated materials and objects. Minimalists deliberately avoided ornamentation and surface texture, choosing their materials instead for their industrial character, and they were interested in the creative possibilities of repetition in allusion to mass production. Minimalists intended viewers to concentrate on the pared down physical qualities of the artwork, to examine the internal relationships between parts and forms, and to study the overall structure made from components. As minimalist painter Frank Stella said, "What you see is what you see." Two of the most prominent minimalists were Donald Judd and Robert Morris, both of whom wrote essays explaining their ideas. And both Judd and Morris, as well as most minimalist artists, really favored the creation of three-dimensional objects. So Donald Judd majored in art and philosophy at Columbia University. He was a painter in his early career, but by the 1960s, he'd begun creating strictly three-dimensional works. He wrote in his essay titled Specific Objects that he preferred sculpture because it existed in actual space. Although he appreciated that the flat surface of a painting emphasizes its existence as a physical object, and he argued that paintings were a type of sculpture because they are physical objects, he also said, quote, "A painting shows something, but a sculpture is something." Judd described the new works that he'd begun creating in the early 1960s, saying, quote, "The new work obviously resembles sculpture more than it does painting, but it's nearer to painting." So in some ways, he's thinking about the space between media, kind of like Robert Rauschenberg. However, Donald Judd resisted the term sculpture for his own works, preferring to call them specific or literal objects. He was highly focused on the physical presence of art and creating actual items that occupy actual space. He insisted that, quote, "actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a flat surface." Judd also rejected the emotion and gesture involved in handcrafted objects by hiring industrial fabricators to create his sculptural materials out of things like plexiglass and steel, paying close attention to color and finishes. He argued that this approach synthesized art's various component parts into a unified whole that could be valued for its formal and material qualities. Judd's earliest specific objects were singular boxy objects installed in rows and progressions of geometric units, placed at mathematically specific intervals on the gallery floor or up the gallery wall. For example, this 1969 iteration, it's simply untitled. It features 10 rectangular units made of galvanized iron and tinted plexiglass, and they're hung precisely 6 inches apart in this vertical row up the wall. Each unit remains independent, but the regular repetition of identical forms serves to sort of unify them and create the impression of a single large sculpture. Here are several other variations of these specific objects using different materials and different colors. He sometimes changes up the amount of space between them to kind of make the entire sculpture fit better within the exhibition space. Judd was very interested in the interplay between solid and void, and he considered the negative spaces between the individual units to be just as much part of the work as those positive components. The industrial fabrication eliminates all expressive elements like brushwork, leaving a smooth, even surface that avoids all references to imagined subjects and allows the objects to be seen only as themselves. So, somewhat similarly, Robert Morris utilized industrial materials and repeated geometric forms, particularly cubes of various materials and scales. Morris argued that minimalist sculpture heightened the psychological perceptions of an object within its spatial surroundings, forcing viewers to consider the art's relationship to their own bodily experience as they move around and interact with it and the space. These ideas were driven in part by Morris's own involvement with experimental dance and performance art. This work from about 1965 to 70, which again is untitled but typically referred to as mirror cubes. It's interesting because the mirrored surfaces of the cubes reflect off of each other and they reflect their surroundings. So the surfaces sort of change as the viewer moves into and then through the space. And the reflections sort of direct the viewer's attention away from the cubes themselves to whatever it is being reflected forcing the viewer to really consider the art's relationship to, again, their own sort of bodily experience. Works like these really contributed to the popular idea that minimalism was theatrical because it relied on space, time, and physical interaction with the viewer. So some artists in the 1960s looked to art making itself as a source of conceptual investigation. In 1968, Robert Morris published an essay he titled Anti-Form, which addressed the importance of materials to artistic process and sculptural form. He and others began exploring the variability of forms. They maintained much of the minimalist vocabulary of simple shapes, repetition, and the minimalist interest in the space around the objects, promoting the viewer's immediate encounter with the object and allowing materials and textures to sort of assert their physical presence. But the materials they used were usually shaped by hand, and they were often unstable or changeable. They tended to still incorporate industrial materials, but instead of the sleek, smooth steel and plexiglass favored by minimalists, they turned to things like industrial fibers, molten lead, fiberglass, and they also incorporated other more natural organic materials. Works of this nature are typically described as process art, a term that emphasizes the process of making over the final object and that highlights how the making processes is often evident within the work itself, or that the final object may be temporary, changeable, or vulnerable to natural processes like gravity and decay. We also sometimes refer to these artists and their works as post-minimalism because they were really reacting against the very impersonal, rational character of minimalism by allowing improvisation, chance processes, messiness, and accidents back into their works, resulting in more expressive, less regulated art that was sort of evocative of more personal meanings and that invites varied interpretations. So one prominent post-minimalist or process artist was the American artist Eve Hesse. She adapted this eccentric abstraction that highlights process and tactility as an alternative to the confrontational, male-dominated minimalist style. Like many of her minimalist colleagues, Hesse often used industrial materials, but again, instead of the steel and the plexiglass, she used latex, polyester resin, fiberglass, etc. Materials whose translucency and texture are much different than the smooth, machine-like minimalist materials. This work, no title, but is sometimes referred to as her rope piece, it exemplifies the organic nature of Hesse's sculptures. In this case, she's tied knots into long pieces of rope before dipping them into liquid latex and then hanging them to dry. The resulting work is a chaotic mass of open, looping webs and dense tangles, showing the pull of gravity on the materials. Hesse wanted this work to look different each and every time that it was exhibited, to morph, shrink, expand, and evolve like a living thing. In many of her works, this one included, the unusual forms and organic quality are suggestive of internal organs or other bodily tissue. But here specifically, we can also interpret these kind of chaotic lines as being three-dimensional representations of the expressive, dripping, swirling lines of Pollock's action paintings. Hesse embraced the instability, irrationality, and emotive power of art, evoking and reflecting her own life and feelings within her works, but balancing that feeling with intellect. Hesse was born to Jewish parents in Germany, and her early life was shaped by the trauma of barely escaping the Holocaust. After settling in New York in 1939, her parents separated, and when she was just 10, her mother died of suicide. In 1966, her father died, and Hesse separated from her husband. One art historian wrote, quote, "The terror and isolation provoked by the death of the artist's father and the withdrawal of her husband from her, instead of forcing an incipient madness, provoked the crystal lucidity of original creation." Hesse said of her works of this period, quote, "It was the first time my idea of absurdity or extreme feeling came through. It was the most ridiculous structure that I ever made, and that is why it is really good. It has a kind of depth or soul or absurdity of life or meaning or feeling or intellect that I want to get at." So many of these process artists really favored the impermanence of their sculptural works and their performances, using it as a way to prevent institutions from reducing art to symbols of wealth and status. Their work can be seen as evidence of a politically charged desire among many artists to view nature as a mysterious source of power and beauty, well suited to countering the social ills brought on by industrial expansion. Some artists, in an effort to move entirely away from the confines of the commercial art gallery and market, explored the potential of landscape and environment as both materials and site for artworks. They used the earth itself as a medium to manipulate, craft, and change. Now, these artists weren't necessarily the first human beings to do things like this. There are countless examples of ancient earthworks from numerous cultures worldwide, such as the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. But the earthworks or the land art of the late 20th century didn't necessarily stem from these ancient traditions, but rather from these artists' desires to work outside the confines of the traditional gallery system and to explore the relationships between object, viewer, and natural space and materials. Some earth artists developed monumental projects that altered the landscape permanently. Others created ambitious but temporary works, and these kind of call attention to the environmental surroundings and the social conditions of their production. Earthworks, which is a term coined by the artist Robert Smithson to describe such artworks, often have some form of documentation through photographs or videos, which make many of the works that are in remote, difficult to access places much more accessible for the general public. But the effort of physically visiting them is often likened to the idea of pilgrimage, making the viewer's encounter of a unique work of art in its natural setting into a spiritual experience. Perhaps one of the most prominent earth artists in the 1960s and 70s was Robert Smithson, who sought to illustrate what he called the ongoing dialectic in nature between the constructive forces that build and shape forms and the destructive forces that eliminate them. One of his most well-known early works is his 1970 spiral jetty, a roughly 1,500-foot stone and earth platform that spirals out into the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Smithson chose the spiral shape because it's a standard shape that occurs in nature. It can be found in DNA molecules, galaxies, seashells, crystals, and it's been used for millennia in the art of various cultures. Its endless curling and uncurling is suggestive of both growth and decay, creation and destruction, or, in Smithson's words, quote, the perpetual coming and going of things. He chose the location because the salty water and algae of the lake suggested to him the primordial ocean where life began, and also a dead sea that killed that life. Abandoned oil rigs that dot the shoreline of the Great Salt Lake reminded Smithson of dinosaur skeletons or the ruins of vanished civilizations. To create Spiral Jetty, Smithson hired workers to use dump trucks to deposit some 6,550 tons of basalt rock and dirt and gradually build up the spiraling roadbed into the lake. Now, the sculpture is not static, but subject to the continuous interaction with nature. Changing water levels in the lake cause the work to be repeatedly submerged and resurfaced, meaning that its appearance changes. For example, when it emerges, it is often encrusted with white salt crystals, but it's also been completely dry during periods of drought. Smithson instructed no maintenance be performed on Spiral Jetty, so the work would be completely governed by the natural elements over time. Eventually, it will probably erode away entirely. Other earth artists work on a smaller scale, including British sculptor and environmentalist Andy Goldsworthy. Goldsworthy makes earthworks that are ephemeral, usually of organic materials that he finds on site, including ice, tree branches, leaves, stones, etc. Often his works last no more than a few hours before the wind scatters them, the tide sweeps them away, or they're otherwise destroyed by the elements. Here in Two Stones, America, in Scotland, Goldsworthy placed red and yellow leaves into depressions in similar-looking rocks in both upstate New York and Scotland. The leaves later dried and blew away. Goldsworthy tries to go into nature every day and make something from whatever he finds. He documents his works in photographs and videos, including the work's disappearance over time. He says, quote, "Time and change are connected to place. Real change is best understood by staying in one place." I'll try to link a short video of Andy Goldsworthy's work on Blackboard so that you can get a better idea of his process and the temporary nature of his earthworks. So many earthworks are site specific, meaning they were created specially for a particular location, and it's often difficult to tell where the earthwork begins and nature ends. The boundaries between art and non art are truly dissolved. Bulgarian artist Christo and his French wife Jean-Claude are known for their monumentally scaled, site-specific projects that temporarily alter the surrounding landscape. They've created about 23 large-scale works over 45 years of collaboration, typically installing these near or within human-made structures or environments, and their works are intended to be seen by huge numbers of people. Their projects require a huge amount of planning and cooperation by the artists, the community, politicians, environmentalists, engineers, and others to really work out the logistics and overcome governmental regulations. This means that it usually takes years to see a work like this to completion, and then the final project only really stays in place for a short period of time. Christo and Jean-Claude often use large swaths of fabric to cover entire buildings or land masses, transforming urban and rural settings into dramatic art installations that demand attention. For example, Running Fence, it was installed across 24 and a half miles of farmland in Bodega Bay in Northern California in 1976. They wrapped the Reichstag building where the German parliament meets in Berlin in 1995. Their works tend to have political and interventionist kind of themes. They reference capitalism and the packaging of consumer products. In this work, Surrounded Islands, they surrounded 11 of the 14 islands in Biscayne Bay next to Miami with these floating skirts of pink woven polypropylene fabric. The couple conceived the idea in 1980, and it took 3 years to work out the engineering and logistics to consider the potential environmental impact and to secure permits and raise money. Christo explained, quote, "All this energy is put to a fantastic, irrational purpose, and that is the essence of the work." The end result here is this harmony of colors. We've got the bright pink within the lush tropical environment, and then the luminous fabric that sort of clings to the islands looks sort of like a reversed lily pad. We've got the leafy green pad in the center and then the pink flower on the exterior instead of the other way around like it occurs in nature. This work is included in your textbook. This is The Gates, Central Park, New York, 1979 to 2005. This work took Cousteau and Jean-Claude 26 years to realize. So they initially came up with the idea in 1979, but they fought obstacles and made changes to their plans and finally installed the work in 2005. It took an army of paid workers to install about 7,503 saffron colored nylon panels on these gates that they installed along 23 miles of pathways within Central Park. The gates lasted for only 16 days, but the brightly colored flapping panels enlivened the frigid winter environment, and the work was ultimately a huge public success. So I've included one more artist in this section, and that's Richard Serra, and he sort of combines elements of minimalism, process, and earthworks. So in the 1970s and 80s, Serra was primarily a minimalist sculptor. He tended to work with simple yet massive shapes of heavy steel. His works demonstrate an awareness of both materials and space. He often situated these pieces of steel within a natural landscape setting, and he was very interested in the weathering process of the material. Other works he installed in gallery spaces, but still sort of exploring the interaction between object, space, and viewer, and how a sculpture might make a person more aware of their experience within a space. In 1981, Sarah won a commission from the U.S. General Services Administration for a sculptural installation in the plaza of the Federal Building in New York City. The administration approved his plans for Tilted Arc, a 12-foot high, 120 feet long, slightly curved Corten steel wall that would bisect the plaza. After its installation, it almost immediately became the subject of criticism and controversy. Many argued the work was a safety hazard and that it made it impossible to utilize the plaza space. Over time, the steel weathered to a rusty brown, and the walls were covered in pigeon droppings and graffiti. Sarah defended the work, saying, quote, "I make work that deals with the environmental components of given places. The historical purpose of placing sculpture on a pedestal was to establish a separation between the sculpture and the viewer. I am interested in creating a behavioral space in which the viewer interacts with the sculpture in its context." Public outrage grew to the point that in 1986, federal workers cut up Tilted Arc and moved it to a Brooklyn parking lot overnight. Sarah was outraged, along with several other artists and critics. He argued that Tilted Arc was site specific and that to remove it was to destroy it because it could not exist elsewhere. He filed a lawsuit claiming censorship, but the federal district court found no legal merit in his case and denied his plea. Eventually, the work was taken to a scrapyard, so it no longer exists. But this is an interesting situation because it prompts us to really think about, to what extent should an artist try to please the public, or kind of consider, shouldn't an artist be given that freedom of expression? Richard Serra thought so. He said, quote, "I don't think it's the function of art to be pleasing. Art is not democratic. It is not for the people."